I'm sitting across from him in the same conference room where, 3 years ago, he fired me for being a woman. Today, I'm back, not to apologize, but to sign an $8 million check. My investment in his company, with one condition he never saw coming. His hands shake slightly as he reaches for the pen, finally understanding that the game has changed, that I'm no longer the player he thought he could discard. My name is Lauren Pierce, and at 34, I thought I had finally cracked the code of Austin's ruthless startup scene. As Senior Project Director at VentureCore Dynamics, I was the architect behind our most successful financial technology solutions. While my male colleagues stumbled through presentations and fumbled strategic analyses, I delivered results that kept our investors happy and our competitors nervous. But success as a woman in tech comes with invisible shackles. Every brilliant idea had to be pitched twice as hard. Every strategic decision required 3 times the justification. And every victory was somehow diminished by the subtle, and not so subtle, reminders that I was an outsider in their boys' club. Eric Dalton, our CEO, embodied everything toxic about Silicon Valley's bro culture transplanted to Texas. Tall, perpetually tanned, with that particular brand of arrogance that comes from inheriting wealth and mistaking it for intelligence. He had a way of looking right through women during meetings, as if our voices were background noise to his grand vision. The kind of man who interrupted female colleagues mid-sentence but hung on every word from his male executives. I should have seen the writing on the wall during our Q3 strategy sessions. While I led the team that developed our revolutionary payment processing algorithm, the one that would eventually save the company, Eric made sure to position himself as the visionary behind every breakthrough. In board meetings, my detailed analyses became his insights. My carefully crafted presentations were delivered by him to applause I'd never receive. The breaking point came during a closed-door meeting about our Series A funding. I had just presented a comprehensive market analysis that identified critical flaws in our expansion strategy. The data was irrefutable. Pursuing the European market too aggressively would drain our resources and leave us vulnerable to domestic competitors. But Eric, in his infinite wisdom, dismissed my concerns with a wave of his hand. "Lauren, you're overthinking this," he said, not even looking up from his phone. "Sometimes you have to trust gut instinct over spreadsheets." I should have stayed quiet. I should have nodded and retreated to my corner office to seethe in private. But 3 years of being mansplained to, talked over, and having my expertise questioned had finally pushed me past my breaking point. "Eric, with all due respect, gut instinct doesn't pay back investors when we're hemorrhaging cash in markets we don't understand." The room went silent. His head snapped up, eyes narrowing with the kind of cold fury I'd seen him direct at competitors, never at his own team. "I think you need to remember who's running this company," he said, his voice dangerously low. 2 weeks later, I was called into HR. The termination letter cited cultural misalignment and communication issues, corporate speak for daring to challenge the golden boy. But Eric's parting words as I cleaned out my desk burned themselves into my memory. "Women just can't handle the pressure at this level. Lauren, this isn't the place for you." As I walked out of VentureCore's gleaming offices for the last time, carrying my personal belongings in a cardboard box like some cliché from a movie, I felt something harden inside me. Not just anger, that would fade. This was something colder, more calculated. A recognition that the game I'd been playing by their rules was rigged from the start. I just needed to learn how to play a different game entirely. The first month after my termination felt like drowning in slow motion. Getting fired wasn't just losing a job. It was professional assassination in an industry where reputation travels faster than gossip at a high school reunion. Eric had been thorough in his character destruction, painting me as difficult, emotional, unable to handle pressure. The whispers followed me everywhere. Former colleagues who used to grab drinks with me after work suddenly became too busy to return my calls. Coffee meetings were canceled last minute. LinkedIn messages went unanswered. It was as if I'd become radioactive, and everyone was afraid that associating with me might contaminate their own careers. The job interviews were a special kind of torture. I'd sit across from hiring managers who'd clearly already heard the stories. Their questions weren't about my qualifications. They were probing for signs of the difficult woman Eric had described. Was I collaborative? How did I handle feedback? Could I work in fast-paced environments without becoming emotional? We've heard you had some challenges at your previous position. One particularly smug interviewer said, not even trying to hide his smirk. Care to elaborate? I wanted to scream. I wanted to lay out every detail of Eric's incompetence, his casual sexism, his complete inability to understand the market dynamics that I'd spent years analyzing. Instead, I smiled and gave some bullshit answer about learning experiences and growth opportunities. After the sixth rejection, I found myself sitting in my car in a parking garage, fighting back tears of frustration. I was 34 years old, unemployed, and rapidly becoming unemployable. My savings account was dwindling, my confidence was shattered, and worst of all, Eric was probably somewhere celebrating his victory over the difficult woman who dared to challenge him. That's when I swallowed my pride and called my Aunt Martha. Martha Kingsley had always been the family enigma. While everyone else pursued traditional careers, she'd spent decades quietly building wealth through what she called strategic investments. My parents had always described her as eccentric, the aunt who showed up to family gatherings in expensive clothes but never talked about her work. I'd foolishly dismissed her as someone who'd never understand real business pressures. I was wrong about everything. You sound defeated, Martha said when I finally worked up the courage to call her. That's not like you. I am defeated, I admitted, sitting in her minimalist downtown loft that probably cost more than most people's houses. I played by their rules and got destroyed for it. Martha poured herself a glass of wine and studied me with those sharp eyes that had always made me uncomfortable as a child. You know what your problem is? You're still thinking like an employee. I don't understand. You're sitting here asking why they won't give you another chance, why they won't hire you, why they won't let you back into their boys' club. She leaned forward, her voice taking on an edge I'd never heard before. The question you should be asking is, why are you still begging for their approval? I stared at her, not comprehending. Sweetheart, you've been trying to win a game where the rules are designed to keep you losing. But there's another game, one where you make the rules. She smiled. And for the first time in months, I saw something other than pity in someone's eyes. Ever consider that maybe getting fired was the best thing that could have happened to you? That night, I couldn't sleep. Martha's words kept echoing in my mind. I'd spent 3 years making Eric's company profitable, analyzing markets, identifying opportunities. I knew the industry inside and out. I understood the players, the trends, the gaps in the market. Maybe it was time to stop being a player and start being the game maker. 6 months later, I was no longer Lauren Pierce, the fired project director. I had become L.P. Kingsley, co-founder of Echelon Ventures, a boutique investment firm specializing in early-stage technology companies. Martha had been right. I'd been playing the wrong game entirely. The transition wasn't easy. Learning the investor side of the equation meant understanding cap tables, liquidation preferences, and board dynamics in ways I'd never needed to as an employee. Martha became my mentor, teaching me how to read between the lines of pitch decks and financial projections. More importantly, she taught me how to weaponize my insider knowledge of the industry. Every company has blind spots, she explained during one of our strategy sessions. Your job is to find them before anyone else does. I threw myself into the work with the intensity of someone who had something to prove. While other investors relied on surface-level metrics and flashy presentations, I dug deeper. I analyzed team dynamics, identified market gaps, and most crucially, I began to understand the ecosystem that Eric operated in. Our first major success came when I identified a small AI startup that was developing technology directly competitive to VentureCore's core offerings. While Eric was focused on expansion, completely ignoring the threat emerging in his own backyard, I was quietly writing a check to his future nightmare. Dataflow Solutions was everything VentureCore wasn't: lean, innovative, and led by a diverse team that actually understood their market. Their founder, Sarah Martinez, had been overlooked by traditional VCs who couldn't see past her age and gender. But I saw what they missed: brilliant strategic thinking combined with deep technical expertise. "Why us?" Sarah asked during our first meeting, clearly suspicious of yet another investor who claimed to understand her vision. "Because I know your competition better than they know themselves," I replied, sliding our term sheet across the table. "And I know exactly where they're vulnerable." The investment paid off beyond my wildest expectations. Within 8 months, Dataflow had secured 3 major clients that Eric had been courting for years. Their technology was simply better, their team was hungrier, and their investor, me, had insider knowledge of every strategic mistake VentureCore was likely to make. I watched from the sidelines as Eric's expansion into Europe began to falter exactly as I'd predicted. The company that had once seemed unstoppable was now struggling to maintain market share against nimbler competitors. Competitors I was quietly backing. But my real breakthrough came when I received an unexpected call from Marcus Reed, VentureCore's former CFO who'd been pushed out in one of Eric's reorganizations. Marcus had been one of the few executives who'd actually respected my work, and he'd been quietly watching my transformation with interest. "I hear you're making moves in the fintech space," he said over drinks at an upscale Austin restaurant. "Word is you've got a good eye for disruptive technology." "I've had good teachers," I replied carefully, not sure where this was leading. "Well, I might have some information that could be useful to someone with your particular insights into the market." That's when I learned about VentureCore's biggest weakness. Their Series B funding round was falling apart. The European expansion had spooked investors. Their technology was losing ground to more innovative competitors, and Eric's leadership was being quietly questioned by the board. "They're going to need fresh capital soon," Marcus continued, "and they're going to need it from someone who understands the space well enough to take a big risk." I maintained my poker face, but inside, I was calculating. This was the opportunity I'd been positioning myself for without even realizing it. Eric's company was vulnerable, and I was now in a position to do something about it. That night, I called Martha with the news. "So what's the play?" she asked, and I could hear the excitement in her voice. "We're going to save VentureCore," I said, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. "Whether Eric wants us to or not." The pieces were finally falling into place. Soon, I would be sitting across from Eric Dalton again, but this time, I'd be holding all the cards. The news hit the tech blogs first. VentureCore Dynamics faces investor exodus as European expansion stalls. I read the headlines over my morning coffee, feeling a satisfaction I hadn't experienced in years. Everything was unfolding exactly as I'd predicted during that final meeting, the one that had cost me my job. Eric's European gamble had been a disaster of epic proportions. The regulatory hurdles he'd dismissed as minor obstacles had turned into insurmountable barriers. The cultural nuances I'd warned him about had resulted in product launches that missed the mark entirely. 3 major investors had already pulled out, citing concerns about leadership and strategic direction. I followed the company's decline with the dedication of a scholar studying a fascinating case study. Their stock price had dropped 30% in 6 months. Key employees were jumping ship, many of them reaching out to me through back channels, asking about opportunities at the companies I was backing. The brain drain was accelerating Eric's problems exponentially. But the real turning point came when I learned that Pinnacle Capital, their primary Series A investor, was demanding a board meeting to discuss strategic restructuring. Venture capital speak for, "We're about to fire everyone and salvage what we can." Martha and I watched it all unfold from our downtown office, tracking every development with the precision of military strategists. Our portfolio companies were thriving. Our reputation in the Austin startup scene was solid, and most importantly, we had the capital and credibility to make big moves. "He's going to need a lifeline soon," Martha observed, reviewing the latest financial reports that Marcus had quietly shared with us. "The question is whether his pride will let him accept it." I knew Eric better than that. His pride would be the last thing to break, but his desperation would come first. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. Not from Eric directly, but from VentureCore's new interim CFO, a sharp woman named Rebecca Torres, who'd been brought in to clean up the financial mess. I'd worked with Rebecca briefly at a previous company and respected her analytical skills. "Lauren, I hope you don't mind me reaching out," Rebecca said, her voice carefully neutral. "I understand you've been quite successful with Echelon Ventures." "I can't complain," I replied, keeping my tone equally professional. "I'm wondering if you might be interested in exploring some investment opportunities. VentureCore is looking at strategic partnerships, and your fund's focus on fintech innovation seems aligned with our needs." The irony was delicious. 3 years ago, Eric had told me I couldn't handle the pressure. Now his company was so desperate for capital that they were approaching the woman he'd fired. "I'd be happy to review any opportunities," I said, already knowing I'd accept. Though I should mention that Echelon has strict criteria for our investments. We typically require significant input on strategic direction. "Of course," Rebecca replied quickly. "We're very open to collaborative partnerships with the right investors." The formal invitation arrived 2 days later. VentureCore Dynamics was seeking Series B funding, and Echelon Ventures was invited to participate in their investor presentation. The meeting was scheduled for the following week, in the same conference room where Eric had fired me. I spent the weekend preparing, but not in the way they expected. While other investors would be analyzing their pitch deck and financial projections, I was reviewing 3 years of insider knowledge about their weaknesses, their blind spots, and most importantly, their desperate need for someone who actually understood their market. Martha reviewed my strategy one final time before the meeting. "You sure you want to do this? Once you walk into that room, there's no going back." "I've been building toward this moment for 3 years," I replied, straightening my blazer. "Eric taught me that success isn't about being right, it's about being in control." As I walked into the VentureCore building that morning, I felt a calmness I hadn't experienced since before my termination. The security guard recognized me and did a double take, but I just smiled and signed in as L.P. Kingsley, Managing Partner, Echelon Ventures. The game was about to begin, and this time, I was the one making the rules. The conference room looked exactly the same: polished mahogany table, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Austin. The same uncomfortable chairs where I'd sat through countless meetings. But everything else had changed. I was no longer the employee seeking approval. I was the investor with the power to grant or deny salvation. Eric entered with his usual swagger, though I noticed the subtle signs of strain. The slightly rumpled shirt, the dark circles under his eyes, the way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes anymore. He was flanked by Rebecca and 2 other executives I didn't recognize, probably brought in to fix his mistakes. "Welcome to VentureCore," Eric began, his voice carrying that familiar, condescending tone as he addressed the room full of potential investors. His eyes swept past me without recognition. I was just another suit with a checkbook, listed in his materials as L.P. Kingsley, Managing Partner. I sat quietly as he launched into his presentation, watching him perform the same dog and pony show that had once impressed board members and investors. But now I could see through every carefully crafted slide, every manipulated metric, every strategic pivot that was really just an admission of failure. "Our European expansion has provided valuable market insights," Eric explained, clicking through slides that showed declining revenues as market penetration investments. The same arrogance that had led to his downfall was still there, just dressed up in corporate speak. When he finished, the room was politely silent. Other investors asked predictable questions about market size and competitive advantages. I waited, letting them expose VentureCore's weaknesses while I prepared for my moment. "Ms. Kingsley," Rebecca finally said, turning to me, "do you have any questions about our strategy?" I stood slowly, letting the moment build. "Actually, I do. But first, I think there's something we need to address." Eric's eyes focused on me for the first time, and I saw the exact moment recognition dawned. His face went pale, then flushed red. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. "Hello, Eric," I said, my voice perfectly calm. "It's been a while." The room went dead silent. Rebecca looked confused, glancing between Eric and me. The other investors sensed drama but couldn't quite place what was happening. You're... Eric stammered, his composure completely shattered. I'm L.P. Kingsley, I replied smoothly. Though you might remember me as Lauren Pierce, the employee you fired 3 years ago for questioning your European expansion strategy. I gestured at the presentation screen. The same strategy that's now bankrupting your company. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Eric's face was cycling through emotions: shock, anger, embarrassment, and finally, a dawning understanding of his position. This is highly irregular, one of the other investors muttered, but no one moved to leave. If anything, they leaned forward with interest. What do you want? Eric asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I walked to the head of the table, standing where he'd delivered his presentation just moments before. I want to save your company. Eric. Echelon Ventures is prepared to lead your Series B round with an $8 million investment. Hope flickered in his eyes before I continued. But we have conditions. Standard for our investments, really. Echelon requires board representation proportional to our investment, which, given your current situation, would be controlling interest. I paused, letting that sink in. We'll also need to approve all strategic decisions moving forward and implement our standard governance structure. Eric's face went through another cycle of emotions. You can't be serious. I'm very serious. Your company is hemorrhaging money, your investors are fleeing, and your technology is losing market share to competitors. I smiled coldly. Competitors I've been funding, by the way. So yes, I'm quite serious. Rebecca cleared her throat. Perhaps we should discuss this privately. No, I interrupted. This is a business decision, and it should be made in a business setting. Eric, you once told me that women can't handle the pressure at this level. You said this wasn't the place for me. I leaned forward slightly. How's that pressure treating you now? The silence stretched until Eric finally spoke, his voice hoarse. And if we refuse? Then Venture Core will be bankrupt within 6 months, and you'll lose everything. I straightened my jacket. But that's your choice to make. I could see him calculating, weighing his pride against his survival. In the end, survival won. We'll need to review the terms with our legal team, he said finally. Of course, I replied, already knowing he had no choice. Take all the time you need. As I gathered my materials, I felt the same satisfaction I'd imagined feeling for 3 years. But it was different than I'd expected. Colder, more professional. The game was over. I had won. The contracts were signed within a week. Eric's lawyers had tried to negotiate, but mathematics don't lie. Venture Core needed our money more than we needed their equity. When you're drowning, you don't negotiate with the lifeguard about swimming techniques. My first board meeting as controlling shareholder was scheduled for the following Monday. I arrived early, claiming the seat at the head of the table that had once been Eric's exclusive domain. When he walked in and saw me sitting there, his jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The balance of power had shifted completely. Good morning, everyone, I began, looking around the table at faces that ranged from curious to openly hostile. I know this transition has been unusual, but Venture Core is hemorrhaging money, and we need to make some immediate changes. Eric shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the same chair where I'd once sat as his subordinate. I think we should discuss any major changes before... Eric, I interrupted smoothly. You're no longer the CEO. As of this morning, the board has voted to restructure your role to Chief Technology Officer. You'll focus on what you actually understand, the technical side of our products. The color drained from his face. You can't just... I can, and I have. I slid a folder across the table to him. Your new contract is inside. The salary is actually quite generous for a CTO position. Rebecca, who'd been quietly taking notes, looked up. Who's the new CEO? I am, I replied, enjoying the sharp intake of breath from around the table. Interim CEO, while we search for a permanent replacement, but given my intimate knowledge of this company's operations, I suspect that search might take quite some time. Over the following months, I systematically dismantled Eric's legacy and rebuilt VentureCore in my own image. The first casualty was his bro culture management team. I replaced 3 of his closest allies with talented professionals, 2 of whom were women. One of whom was a brilliant African-American engineer who'd been overlooked for promotion under Eric's leadership. The changes went deeper than personnel. I killed the European expansion entirely, redirecting those resources towards strengthening our domestic market position. I implemented the risk management protocols I'd tried to introduce 3 years earlier, the ones Eric had dismissed as overthinking. Most satisfying of all, I hired Sarah Martinez from Dataflow Solutions as our new VP of Innovation. The woman who'd been building technology to compete with us was now leading our development efforts. Eric's former competitors were becoming his colleagues. "You're enjoying this," Martha observed during one of our regular dinners. "More than you probably should." She wasn't wrong. Every morning, I walked into the office that had once been Eric's, sat behind the desk where he'd made the decision to fire me, and ran the company he'd nearly destroyed. The poetic justice was almost too perfect. But the real satisfaction came from watching VentureCore's recovery. With competent leadership and strategic focus, we began winning back clients we'd lost. Our technology improved rapidly under Sarah's guidance. The stock price stabilized, then began climbing. The tech press took notice. VentureCore's remarkable turnaround under new leadership ran in TechCrunch. How Lauren Pierce saved the company that fired her was featured in Forbes. The narrative was irresistible. The woman who'd been dismissed for questioning strategy was now vindicated by results. Eric, meanwhile, had been relegated to the sidelines. His opinions were politely noted and quietly ignored. In meetings, he'd start to object to decisions, then remember his new position and fall silent. The man who'd once dominated every conversation now barely spoke unless directly addressed. I caught him one evening, working late in his new, smaller office. He looked up when I knocked on his door frame. "Long day?" I asked, genuinely curious about his state of mind. "Every day's long now," he replied, his voice flat. "You got what you wanted." "I got what the company needed," I corrected. "There's a difference." He stared at me for a long moment. "Do you really believe that? Or is this just elaborate revenge?" I considered the question seriously. "Maybe it started as revenge, but look at our quarterly numbers. Eric, look at employee satisfaction scores. Look at our technology pipeline." I leaned against his doorframe. Sometimes revenge and justice end up looking exactly the same. He had no answer for that. As I walked back to my office, I realized that the anger that had driven me for 3 years was finally beginning to fade. It was being replaced by something much more dangerous, the satisfaction of absolute power. The quarterly board meeting was scheduled for a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after I'd walked back into VentureCore as an investor. The conference room was packed, not just with board members, but with major shareholders who'd flown in from New York and San Francisco. Word had spread through the investment community about VentureCore's remarkable turnaround, and everyone wanted to see the woman who'd orchestrated it. I'd spent weeks preparing for this moment, but not in the way anyone expected. While Eric assumed this would be a celebration of our recovery, I had a different agenda entirely. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, standing at the head of the table with a stack of documents beside me. "I want to thank you all for joining us today. As you can see from our quarterly reports, VentureCore has exceeded all projections. Revenue is up 43%. Our technology pipeline is stronger than ever. And we've successfully repositioned ourselves as a market leader." Murmurs of approval rippled around the table. Eric, sitting in his diminished position halfway down the table, actually managed a small smile. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. "However," I continued, and the room fell silent. "Our success has highlighted some fundamental questions about leadership and vision that we need to address." Eric's smile faded. He leaned forward slightly, sensing danger but not yet understanding its source. "Over the past year, we've had to correct numerous strategic errors made by previous leadership. The European expansion debacle cost us nearly $12 million and 18 months of development time. Client relationships were damaged, investor confidence was shaken, and our competitive position was severely compromised. I walked around the table slowly, letting my words sink in. More troubling were the cultural issues we've had to address. A toxic work environment that drove away talented employees, discriminatory practices that exposed us to legal liability, and a management style that prioritized ego over results. "Lauren," Eric said, his voice tight with warning, "I think we should focus on our current success rather than relitigating past." "I'm not relitigating anything," I interrupted smoothly. "I'm providing context for the motion I'm about to present to this board." The room went dead silent. Even the sound of traffic from the street below seemed to fade away. "I move that we hold a vote of no confidence in Eric Dalton's ability to serve in any leadership capacity at Venture Core Dynamics." Eric shot to his feet, his face flushing red. "You can't be serious. I founded this company." "You nearly destroyed it," I replied calmly. "And given your track record, I don't believe our shareholders can afford to risk your involvement in any strategic decisions moving forward." The board members exchanged glances. I could see them calculating, weighing Eric's founding role against the undeniable results of my leadership. "This is a coup," Eric said, his voice rising. "You're using your position to settle personal scores." "I'm using my position to protect our shareholders' investments," I corrected. "Which is exactly what a CEO should do." Martha, who'd been quietly observing from her position as lead investor, finally spoke. "I second the motion." "All in favor?" I asked, already knowing the outcome. One by one, hands rose around the table. The major institutional investors went first, followed by the smaller shareholders. In the end, it was unanimous except for Eric himself. "The motion passes," I announced. "Eric, you'll receive a severance package commensurate with your founding role, but your employment with Venture Core is terminated effective immediately." Eric stood there for a moment, looking around the table at faces that had once deferred to his every decision. The silence stretched until he finally spoke. "You're doing this just because I fired you, aren't you?" I met his gaze directly, feeling the weight of 3 years of planning culminating in this single moment. "No, Eric, I'm doing this because I can." The simple truth of that statement hung in the air like a verdict. He taught me that power wasn't about being right, it was about being in control. And now Security was waiting outside to escort him from the building. As he gathered his things, I felt a strange emptiness where my anger used to be. The man who'd once seemed so formidable now looked smaller, older, defeated. "The board meeting is adjourned," I announced. "Thank you all for your time." As the room emptied, I remained standing at the head of the table, looking out at the Austin skyline. 3 years ago, I'd walked out of this building humiliated and broken. Today, I owned it. The game was over. And I had won completely. 6 months later, I stood in the same conference room where this story began. But the atmosphere was entirely different. The walls now displayed awards for workplace diversity and innovation. The table was surrounded by faces that reflected the company I'd built, diverse, talented, and hungry for success in ways that had nothing to do with proving masculinity. Venture Core's transformation had become a case study taught in business schools. The Pierce turnaround was cited in Harvard Business Review as an example of how strategic leadership and inclusive culture could revitalize a failing company. Our stock price had tripled, our employee satisfaction scores were industry-leading, and our technology was setting new standards in fintech. But success, I'd learned, was a strange beast. The anger that had driven me for 3 years had dissipated, leaving behind something I hadn't expected, a sense of responsibility that went far beyond personal vindication. The quarterly numbers are exceptional, Sarah Martinez reported, now our Chief Innovation Officer. But more importantly, we've created a sustainable model for growth that doesn't depend on toxic leadership or unsustainable risk-taking. I nodded, scanning the faces around the table. These weren't Eric's yes men or the products of a boys' club. They were professionals who'd earned their seats through competence, vision, and results. The company I'd built was everything VentureCore could have been if ego hadn't gotten in the way. After the meeting, I retreated to my office and pulled out the framed newspaper clipping I kept in my desk drawer. It was from the Austin Business Journal, dated 3 years ago. VentureCore Dynamics Parts Ways with Senior Project Director. The article was small, buried on page 6, and mentioned me only in passing. Eric had controlled that narrative completely. This morning's Wall Street Journal told a different story. The headline read, "Lauren Pierce named Tech CEO of the Year." The article detailed not just VentureCore's recovery, but the broader impact of my leadership style on the Austin startup ecosystem. Other companies were adopting our inclusive hiring practices, our transparent decision-making processes, our focus on sustainable growth over quick wins. I hadn't set out to become a symbol of anything. I'd simply wanted to prove that Eric was wrong about me. But in proving him wrong, I'd accidentally proven something much more important, that revenge, when executed with precision and patience, could become indistinguishable from justice. The irony wasn't lost on me. Eric had fired me for being a woman, claiming I couldn't handle the pressure of leadership. In response, I'd become exactly the kind of leader he never could be. One who understood that true power came not from dominating others, but from elevating them. My phone buzzed with a text from Martha. "Dinner tonight. I have a proposal for our next investment." I smiled, already knowing that whatever she had in mind would be bigger than VentureCore, more ambitious than anything Eric had ever imagined. The game I'd learned to play wasn't just about winning, it was about changing the rules for everyone who came after. As I packed up my things for the day, I caught my reflection in the window. The woman staring back at me looked nothing like the defeated employee who'd been escorted out of this building 3 years ago. She looked like someone who'd learned that the best revenge wasn't destruction, it was reconstruction. Eric had taught me that business was war. But I'd learned something he never understood. The most decisive victories are the ones that make your enemies irrelevant. Walking out of VentureCore that evening, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Not the peace of completion, but the peace of knowing that some stories end exactly as they should. The game was over, but the revolution I'd started was just beginning. Thank you for listening to this story of transformation and strategic revenge. I'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening to this story? Are you commuting to work, taking a break from your own career challenges, or perhaps dealing with your own difficult boss? Please comment below and let me know your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share your own experiences with workplace challenges. Your story might inspire the next tale of triumph over adversity.